Hello, everyone.
Welcome to the Queers of Time podcast.
I'm Matt.
I'm James.
I'm Camille.
And I'm Kat.
And this is a podcast to talk about all the gay stuff in the Wheel of Time.
Because we're gay and we like the Wheel of Time. And as always, shout out to Lurks, our feral venerator of Serene.
So today, Camille and I are going to be discussing the latest installment in our Queers of Time book club series. We started the year off with Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, and then we moved to Project Not by Chelsea Ferretti. And this time we're moving back in time again to 1913 when an author named EM Forster wrote a novel called Maurice, which is, I believe, the first known gay novel that has a happy ending. And we're here to discuss and prompt book club discussion. As always, if you want to get involved in that, our Discord server has a channel dedicated to the book club and to the book of the month.
Yay!
Yay!
So I gotta say that on the 3 books that we got to read for the book club, that one was the hardest for me to read.
Yeah, Maurice it's a difficult book. It's a very deeply psychological book, and I think if we're going into it expecting like a rom-com, well, rom-coms didn't exist back then, and
I mean, I didn't go into it expecting that. For me,
right.
It wasn't about being psychological or not. It's a book from the early 20th century, and
Yeah.
I am English is still my second language only. And I think I have very much middle school grade of English, maybe. I don't know.
No. No, your English is much better than that.
And I think, so the thing is that I've read a lot of English. I've read a lot more modern English. And that one, there was a lot of moments where I was like, what the fuck is going on? I have no clue.
I mean, there's 3 things.
I still liked the book overall. And I think it was... I had the bad tendency for that book to read like a few chapters and then stop. And sometimes I would stop for several days. But I would notice that, especially when I was finishing it the past few days, since I was reading a lot of it during the same session, it was easier for me to get into it. And once I was into it, it was easier to understand, even if there were still moments where I was like, which character are they talking about? What exactly is going on here? Who just showed up in that room? And but yeah, it's a level of English that is still a bit at my limits right now, and it just means that I need to read more stuff to challenge my English, I guess.
I mean, it's always good to challenge yourself.
Oh yeah, that's how you learn.
Yeah. I wouldn't, if anybody's tried this novel, whether English is your first, second, or third, etc. language, I wouldn't go hard on yourself because there's 3 things. First, it's an old novel. It's I think 110 years old. So the prose is different, the culture and the society is different, but also there's EM Forster's writing style, which is it throws you in. It does not explain anything. It just characters come onto the scene and they're just there, and you just got to keep up with it, and that can be hard.
Yeah, for example, in when a character that you already saw before shows up again, he will never explain, oh, that's the guy we saw in that circumstances.
Right.
It's the name is there, and for you to figure out who that was again.
Exactly. So those are 2 things that are just that make it a bit of a tricky read. And the third is that the type of novel it is. It's a modernist work, and for those listening, similar types of writers include Steinbeck and Hemingway and Virginia Woolf. Well, I guess Virginia Woolf might be also postmodern, but a lot of what you read in the novel is actually not in the novel. There's a lot of meaning in what isn't said, and it can be kind of jarring. So it's a hard novel to wrap your mind around, but I feel once you do wrap your mind around it, it goes pretty smoothly.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a lot of reading between the lines.
Yeah.
And reading between the lines is already not my forte in general. So I struggle a little bit for that one. But I still think there was some very interesting aspects to the novel.
Oh, yeah. So I thought we would start, I guess, the official discussion by me giving a little bit of background to the novel, and we're going to have a section where I sort of give an analysis with spoilers that might serve to help a little bit in digging through parts of the novel. And then we'll talk about tips for reading and questions that we have, and Camille also has thoughts. So yeah, that's, I guess, generally the structure of the episode. So if you're ready, I will start with the...
Yeah, sure. Please give me a lesson of anything that's going on. And
as Professor Matt, as they call Professor Matt in the Discord. So yeah, in the States we say Maurice, but I think it's just Maurice in in the UK or in England. So it was published in 1971, which was a year after EM Forster's death. Maurice was written between 1913 and 1914, which is bonkers when you read it because it's 110 years old and it's a novel of, well, in the words of the contemporaries, homosexual love. It was the first novel that we know of with explicitly queer love containing a happy ending. And Forster didn't want to publish it in his lifetime. I think there's mention on the Wikipedia article and in biographies that he had scribbled into the manuscript, publishable, but is it worth it? Homosexuality was criminalized until 1967 in England, which was only 4 years before Forster's death. So he was born in the 19th century. He's a product of Victorian England, and he only saw his sexuality, his sexual orientation decriminalized 4 years before he died. The most notable works of his include A Room with a View and A Passage to India, and also a book called Howard's End. And these books dealt with themes of colonialism, imperialism, individualism, freedom, and feminism. And we always talk about, there's always a discussion of separating the art from the artist, but I think when it comes to what an author's trying to say, it's useful to contextualize them both in their time and as they are individuals. And I think it would be negligent to not mention that EM Forster was, I don't think I would call him a leftist by any means, but he was a humanitarian. He had big issues with colonialism. His novel, A Passage to India, can be read. It is kind of problematic today because it's aged, but like in the time it was written, it came from a very anti-colonialist mindset and mentality. He depicted the people of India as fully realized, conceptualized humans and not these lesser beings that deserve to be colonized, which a lot of authors like Rudyard Kipling seemed to continue to perpetuate. So like that's the background on EM Forster. So he had big problems with class. He did not come from a wealthy background, and he grew up in a time that was transitory. Victorian England had basically come to an end, I think, in 1901 or 02. And there's this transitory period between the old, with the aristocrats and high society and lords and ladies, and this idea of anybody, no matter how they're born, can move upward in life or move however they want in life. So a lot of his fiction deals with that, and I think Maurice especially, but I'll get into that in a bit. So these days, we have a lot of representation and books that can just solely be romance novels, and that's amazing. I think it's great that we've moved to the point where we can just have queer romance that's just romance, and it focuses on that aspect. But Maurice is often framed as a romance novel, and I don't think that's entirely correct because EM Forster was first and foremost a writer who strove to analyze and criticize society through story.
Yeah, you can really feel that in the book.
Yes.
There's a lot of criticizes about the world in which Maurice evolves in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and different authors have different styles of criticizing things, or just doing things. Like these days, it is popular in some writers' circles to wear the moral or the message of your novel on your sleeve and to hammer the point home to the audience repeatedly. I don't think that's good storytelling. I don't think that's a good writing style. But your mileage may vary. Forster was definitely more subtle, and we'll talk about that when we get into the chunky meats of the homosexuality, the story. But yeah, it's a complicated novel. Not necessarily complicated to read, but there's just layers and layers to it that you just discover on reread. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? I know I just said a lot of words.
I do think that it's a novel that for me would benefit from a reread.
Mm-hmm.
I did notice a lot about class, about misogyny too. There was one thing that really struck me when I was reading the first part of that book is how often Maurice acts because he's supposed to act in a certain way without always understanding why he's doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think it's how do I call that? It's an interesting novel that reflects a period of time that I don't know much about. Like Victorian England is not something that I've particularly got to like read about in the past.
Yeah.
I've read, for example, more like classic literature in French, in France, which is going to be talking about that period of time in France and this kind of thing. And even then, it's starting to date. But yeah, it was interesting, for example, when they were talking about Cambridge or when they were all criticizing socialists in like, while you can very obviously see that no, they are not that rich and they have plenty of problems to figure out, but still let's criticize that type of person. Anyway, it was very interesting on that aspect.
No, you're right. And that's the sort of subtlety that I like about this book is the author doesn't say, okay, now the rich people are dumb and only by escaping from that mentality can you be happy. And he doesn't like hammer it home time and again. What he does is he, like you said, he shows this family that thinks itself wealthy and they do have titles. They represent old England and they're complaining about socialists and about poor people, and all around them, their house is literally crumbling. And I think that's more powerful of a commentary than just telling us.
There was this scene when they were talking, like they were basically bashing poor people. At the same time, there was water running from the roof.
Exactly.
Like water falling on the piano or something like that. And it was kind of hilarious.
It really is. So what was your favorite part of the novel?
There was that's hard to say. There's one thing that made me laugh a lot about Maurice is that is someone that is definitely portrayed as not being particularly smart and pretty much oblivious to a lot of things. But also, I wouldn't also consider I consider him as a bad person, because a lot of, like, even when he's a mean person, there's a lot of it that is very much, but that's how he's supposed to act as like the man of his family and this kind of thing. But like one moment that just made me laugh a lot is when he finally got with Clive. I don't know. Clive. And it's like, I've wanted to make you whole jokes about Maurice because he's like very close to everyone, and suddenly there's this guy that he finally get into a relationship with, and the next day they have like a 15 hours long date where they're skipping class and he get expelled from that. and it's very like innocent in a way. It's like, oh, life finally makes sense. No, I don't care about any consequences whatsoever. And you could say, oh, it's a first love thing, but he does exactly the same thing when he gets with Alec. And I don't know, I found it hilarious. It's like for most of the novel, Maurice is so detached. It's so far away from everyone. Like there's this emotional barrier between him and pretty much everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But when he crosses this barrier, it's like he becomes a completely different person.
Yeah. Did you notice that? So the end of part 3 is when he has sex with Alec. And did you notice in part 4 that the prose itself is also a lot closer to the characters? Like it sort of takes on, because the writing is kind of distant in parts 1 through 3, because Maurice is distant from himself.
Yeah, I agree with that. I did not specifically think about it because prose is not always something that I notice.
Right.
But there is definitely a different vibe between that last part and everything before.
It's almost like a new book.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I feel like every part has a different structure, like prose from the other part, in the sense that, like the first part, I'm sorry, it's so obvious that Maurice is just living his life as if, I mean, movie wasn't really a thing back then, but as if he was watching a movie of his life and not really being an active participant in his life.
Right. He was a passive participant in his own
He's
life.
very much a passive participant in everything that's going on in his life. He goes to that specific college because that's where he's supposed to go. There's a sentence in like, I think it's like the 3rd chapter or something like that, where he basically starts to bully other guys that seem a bit too weak and this kind of thing. And he's just basically saying, I'm not cruel. That's what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
And then there's this like, he slowly start to change a little bit when he start to meet Clive, because there's this like, Clive as a character is someone that I'm struggling with because it's a guy that goes somewhere and then completely changes his mind about something. But also is very much hypocritical about some aspects, because he kind of like, Maurice probably wouldn't ask himself a bunch of questions without Clive asking the question in the first place.
Exactly.
Maurice was a Christian and like didn't really question anything about it until Clive starting to push him to do so. Maurice like was basically following the heteronormative society because that's what he thought he was supposed to do, until Clive kind of asked him again about that.
Yeah. And I guess that could be a good segue for me to talk about like the analysis of the relationships in a spoiler context, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Professor Matt, segment part 2. So spoilers ahead. This is going to spoil the plot and the 2 relationships of the novels. So a lot of readers I've seen like on Goodreads and stuff have concluded like, oh, it's just a tale of privileged white boys being privileged and white and vaguely gay, and then being turned off by the fact that the main characters are upper class. And it seems like some even come to the conclusion that it's being romanticized and idealized. And I've also seen arguments that you can't read the novel, or it's hard to read the novel because you can't separate the story, the homosexuality, from issues of like class. But my thing is, you're not supposed to separate the gay part from the social and the class part, because the author was very intentionally writing a novel in which a man cannot discover and embrace his true identity until he abandons the quote-unquote civilized Britain that's held him in its grasp for so long. The only truly romantic parts come near the end, right? When he's essentially learned to unlearn everything his society and his class and Clive have taught him. We're not meant to be sympathetic with or even like the upper class. Like we talked about how he juxtaposes their criticizing socialism and liberalism while sitting in their crumbling mansions. And it's only, I guess the essential point of the novel is that happiness and love are incompatible with the old ways of England, and it's only once Maurice discovers that he's able to become a better person and truer version of himself that he actually does, and he separates.
And I feel like, okay, I'm just going to interrupt quickly, but I feel like it's still true about the upper class in England. Because
oh yeah, like they're still clinging to that.
Like they're still clinging to what they are supposed to do, who they should marry, and this kind of thing. And it's like, I don't know. It's thinking about Prince Harry that had to shut down every contact he had with his family because the marriage he made didn't please some people, more or less.
Yeah,
It's still very much like that.
It is. It's unfortunate. There is less power. The House of Lords has much less power than it did back in EM Forster's day, but like it's pathetic how the upper class and the monarchy just grasp onto their relevance. Like, dude, y'all are a bunch of inbred dogs, chihuahuas. Like, you're just a bunch of inbreds who have been hoarding money for generations. No one likes you. Just stop. Just go away. The world doesn't need you. But this is my analysis on the two and again, this is spoiler filled, the two relationships in the novel. So Maurice and Clive are a representation of the old way, the Hellenistic or the Greek view of life that clings to tradition and masculinity. Like when we say Hellenistic, like there was this whole thing about romanticizing Greco-Roman period, like the Roman Empire, Greek life. And like really Victorian England just grasped onto those things as like the ideal masculine, the ideal relationship. And Clive sort of represents this part of society. And the novel actually says that they were both misogynists, but Clive more so. Like they're not in love with each other because they're gay. It seems like they're more into each other because they're men. And maleness is the ideal beauty, and their love is the idealized virtue as shown in Plato's works, which are referenced a lot. This kind of idea of love, frankly, rests on the ideals of imperialism, propriety, class. It's largely emotional, but it's never sexual, and it's barely physical.
It feels like two incels upping up each other.
It does. That is a good idea. That's a good. It feels like two incels like upping each other. Yeah, that's a good analogy. And then we have Maurice and Alec, who are a representation of the new way, or a way that Forster saw as new, a way in which class barriers come down and other barriers come down. It's love that is sexual, physical, emotional, romantic. And in going all in on Alec, Maurice has to abandon this Hellenistic or idealized version of love that's rooted in misogyny, empire, and idealism. And like it's said that he never sees Clive again. Like once he abandons this part of his life, it's done. He has to abandon all of it wholesale. And we sort of even see this. There's an epilogue that Forster wrote that got edited out, which I would like to see, but whatever. But in this epilogue, we find out that Maurice and Alec are woodcutters living in the forest, and they've basically abandoned society and have carved out their own path. And I would love for that to be included in the novel because I think it's the perfect, thematic conclusion to the novel.
Yeah, I didn't know about that epilogue, but it feels very close to the actual author notes at the end of the novel. Mm-hmm. When EM Forster is talking about where did the idea come from, and he talks about this couple that kind of has abandoned society. Not really, but like, yes. I don't know. It's when you learn about that couple, it does remind you of Maurice and Alec, because there's one of the upper class and one from the worker class, and they have.
Oh, is it Edward Carpenter and George Merrill?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is another bonkers thing, because like we think of gay rights as like, oh yeah, that started happening at Stonewall, but like Edward Carpenter was he was a socialist, a philosopher, and he was also like a gay rights advocate. And he had a relationship with a working class guy named George Merrill. And I haven't read that afterward, but you said that he mentioned them, so.
Can I don't know if you, do you mind if I read part of it? Because
go ahead.
The conclusion about homosexuality is actually pretty nice in a way.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, since Maurice was written, there has been a change in the public attitude here. The change from ignorance and terror to familiarity and contempt. It is not the change towards which Edward Carpenter had worked. He had hoped for the generous recognition of an emotion and for the reintegration of something primitive into the common stock. And I, though less optimistic, had supposed that knowledge would bring understanding. We had not realized that what the public really loses in homosexuality is not the thing itself, but having to think about it. Mm-hmm. If it could be slipped into our midst unnoticed or legalized overnight by a decree in small print, there would be few protests. Unfortunately, it can only be legalized by Parliament, and members of Parliament are obliged to think or to appear to think. Consequently, the Wolfenden recommendations will be indefinitely rejected. Police prosecutions will continue, and Clive on the bench will continue to sentence Alec in the dock. Maurice may get off. And it's sad because it was written in September 1960. And while our society is not perfect, I wish they would be able to see how far we've moved along since then.
Yeah, I am glad that he lived to see the decriminalization of male homosexuality, because in merry old England back then, women didn't have a sexuality, so they weren't legislated against.
I mean, who cares about the woman?
Who cares about the woman? They don't have penises. They're just baby makers. But yeah, I'm glad that he lived to see the decriminalization. It would have been nice that he lived to see, better days, but and maybe he also saw, I'm sure he heard about the Stonewall riot. It is wild to think, because we don't really think about like overlapping time, but like it's wild to think that somebody born in the Victorian era lived to see the Stonewall movement.
Yeah.
It's just it is wild. There's actually there's a thing I read that the last living widow of a U.S. Civil War veteran died in 2011.
Oh, what?
Yeah. Yes. So, so the Civil War. So just the general timeline of the U.S. Civil War is 1863 to 66 or 65. So the idea that the last surviving widow of a Civil War veteran died in 2011 is bonkers, but it's kind of an ick story. She was, I believe, 11 years old in the early 1900s, and her family married her to this really old guy who was a Civil War vet for his pension, because they get a lifetime pension. And it's a difficult conversation. It's obviously way beyond the topic of the podcast, but they didn't marry her off to be a child bride. They married her off as basically an insurance scam or a health insurance scam. There's no indication that they ever consummated the marriage, but they were legally married, and she continued collecting his Civil War pension until 2011 when she died.
I find it kind of hilarious.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's because unfortunately child brides were just so common back then. But from what I understand, they were just apparently her father did this guy, the veteran, a favor. And he was like, yo, I'll marry your kid, even though she's 12. I'll marry her, and your family can have my pension. And it's okay, well, that's bizarre. That's weird. We would frown on that today. Better than some of the other things.
Yeah, smart move if you want some cash, I guess.
Yeah, but yeah, so there's just a lot of stuff going on in Maurice, and it's like I said, it's a very transitory period between, because it wasn't written in Victorian. I think it was written in Edwardian times, right before World War I.
Yeah,
I don't know,
a year or two before World War.
Mm-hmm.
She's kind of insane too, because it's also very interesting to read that novel that is describing England 2 years before the First War.
Right. It's weird. It's really weird. So I have questions. I guess questions for discussion for our listeners who want to participate in the book club. If you want me to read those off.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So the first one is, do you find Maurice's journey to be realistic, and do any parts of it resonate with you? And I guess we can go ahead and answer that ourselves if you want to answer.
For me, it was very realistic, at least on the homosexuality aspect, because he is basically in a society where homosexuality is not acknowledged. So of course it's going to take forever to understand that. There was the weight of society's norms. One thing that I found sadly quite relatable was Maurice is a very lonely character. Like, pretty much the only persons that he built some sort of relationship with are Clive and Alec. But like it doesn't get along well with his family. He doesn't have friends. His work is just his work. It doesn't it felt to me a bit autistic, but it's probably not the case. He's just a lonely man.
Yeah, I would say the same. Like, I found his journey to be realistic. And like, be forewarned, there are parts of the novel where Maurice is just downright unpleasant. But I think it's honestly a realistic portrayal of someone who is not only fighting to accept and fighting against their identity, but then having their heart broken in the process. Like, he does some pretty asshole shit to his friends, or what friends he has in his family. It's not pretty, but it's realistic. And I think a novel that I think like glossing it over just wouldn't have been honest. So I do think it was realistic, and it also resonated for the reasons that you said. The next question is, who was your favorite character and why?
I mean, I'm going to have to say Maurice because he's the one we get to see a lot of. I do feel like maybe on reread it would change, because since like the book has a tendency to stick to the surnames until Maurice gets close enough to someone to use the first name. But like, for example, Clive, I was able to get him when he joined the book. But like, for example, Alec, I don't remember when we first see him. And there's a lot of his interaction with Maurice at the beginnings that I didn't really got, because I don't think I was understanding who we were talking about. And there's a lot of different characters in this book, and it's always a bit complicated to figure out who's going to be important and who is not. And I think I missed a few things that it may be good for me to reread at some point to grasp a bit more.
Yeah. That makes sense. For me on reread, it's definitely Alec. He's just this sort of scrappy, I don't give a shit type of person. He's just like, he's such a bad gamekeeper from the perspective of the aristocracy, because he just mouths off. He's like, I don't care. I do what I want. Like, I'm a person. I'm a fully living human being, and I don't care.
I don't care that you have a title.
Yeah, I don't care that you have a title. It's like, I don't fucking care.
Your worth is not higher than mine because of your title.
Yeah, and that's why I like him. And also I like him because he just accepts Maurice as he is. It's just I love Alec.
I really liked his letters.
Yes, his letters are great.
It's, again, very funny. It's two men who've met each other, who've known each other for a few weeks, who slept together once, and then Alec is basically sending some very moving letter begging Maurice to show up, and nobody has any chill in that book.
Yeah, really, it's you're right, and then nobody has any chill. It's just it's great.
Yeah, I was happy for Maurice and Alec.
Me too. I
really was happy. Yeah,
I love their story, and the last section of the novel really is like a romance, more like the most romance-like story. But so the last question, and it's one that I think Blonde Landfair alluded to in our Discord chat, which you can join once again. This question is, does Clive strike you as being on the ace spectrum, or does his behavior strike you as just being part of the religious and social repression of the time, or could both be true? And that is probably a discussion that is like a chunky discussion.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like there's a bit of both.
Yeah.
What strikes me, like, especially with the summary you brought earlier, is how there was this idealization of like antique Greece and this kind of thing, and then once he go to Greece and figure out that probably the reality is not meeting the expectations, is suddenly like, oh, turns out I'm straight. And I don't know where does that come from. Maybe he was a bit on the ace spectrum, and that's why he was idealizing those relationships between men. And I don't know.
Yeah, and this is the problem. Like, so it's a problem, not a problem, it's an issue when you try to put our modern labels onto old characters, because these labels didn't exist and these identities didn't, like the identities as we know them now didn't exist, but the phenomenon itself existed. Like there have always been ace people in the world.
And I mean the ace spectrum is, sometimes I'm just wondering if it's just like a way to say there's some people who really enjoy sex and really like it and really want some, and some people who's not particularly into that, and that's fine. It's
it's
and you can have different phase in different, you can enjoy, like sexuality can be very different to you at different period of your life too.
Yeah. And one thing I want to point out to readers who may have noticed that so two things that happened in the novel that you may not have picked up on is, one, that Maurice masturbates several times in the novel, but it is not explicitly said that he does that. It's more framed around like, oh, he returned to the habits of childhood that provided temporary release. That's masturbation.
I didn't get that. I'm going to be honest. I was like, I was very curious about like sexuality for them, especially like I don't think I got that Clive and Maurice had not slept together until very later on, when Maurice starts saying an hypnotist.
The hypnotist,
to and like the question was asked, and because I don't know, I feel like I kind of assumed that they were together, so they had a relationship in every aspect, and no, it just I they probably mentioned it and I didn't get it, which is fine. So, I probably missed a lot of those in the middles, and that's very much a language thing.
I mean, I missed it the first time through when I read this several years ago, and I said, hold on, wait a second, when I read through it this time, and then I reread the section like, oh, he's choking the chicken. Okay.
He's choking the chicken.
Episode title.
He's choking. It could be, honestly, could be.
So this places Maurice as a sexual being who is like embracing sexual, like the physicality of sex. And another thing that readers may have missed is that Clive and Anne, when they do have sex, they don't see each other naked. And a lot of people ask, well, how could that happen? Well, there used to be this thing. It was a marital bedsheet, popular in different cultures. It was essentially a bedsheet with a hole cut in the middle of it.
It's a glory hole.
It was a sanctified glory hole. It was a church approved glory hole.
Yeah, I definitely got about that Clive and Anne were not seeing each other naked.
No, and that was very common.
Does like vibe with the ace thing for Clive.
Yeah, it does, but it was very common back then to have the church approved glory hole to prevent couples from seeing each other.
I mean, couples doing like sleeping apart was also not that uncommon, I guess.
Right.
So,
yeah, which honestly I don't blame them.
Yeah.
Not for like prudishness reasons, but I need my bed space. I'm sorry. So yeah, it's hard for me because I don't want to put Clive squarely in the ace identity, because a lot of how he views himself in the world is rooted in misogyny and empire and colonialism. I think the the closest answer I can give is that I believe that he is using these things as an excuse to live the life the way he feels he wants to live it. But I wouldn't feel comfortable like saying, oh yeah, Clive is ace representation, because I would not call him ace representation. I'm not ace, so I can't declare that like it's gospel truth, but like that's my intuition. If there are ace listeners out there who have read the book, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. But yeah, those 3 questions, we can post them in the Discord chat, and looking forward to seeing what other people's thoughts are.
Yeah, that's some good questions. And I think that's pretty much it for this discussion.
I think so too. It was sorry, I did most of the talking. I'm so sorry. If there's anything else that you want to say.
I did got to say most of what I wanted to say, I think.
Okay.
It's definitely a book that when I finished it, I was like, not sure what I'm going to be able to talk about. Because it gave me a lot of thoughts, and sometimes translating thoughts into words, it's not the easiest thing for me to do. And but I was happy to read it.
Yeah, it's a novel that I think a lot of people are happy to have read.
Yeah, and I really love the dedication at the start, dedicated to a happier year.
Yes, I love it. It's so sweet.
Yeah. Well, on this, thank you for listening to this episode of The Queers of Time. If you enjoyed it, you can find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, Tumblr. We have a Discord, as it's been mentioned a few times during the episode. Feel free to join it. We have sometimes some very deep conversation about random stuff. These days, books, but sometimes it's other things. And we also have a Patreon if you would like to support us. We always appreciate the support, because producing a podcast does have a cost. Have a cost. Anyway.
Money, please.
Thank you again for listening, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for listening. This was Queers of Time, a Wheel of Time podcast. The music is Dance of the Witches by Julius H.